Ler mai as Felcheru. Good day and welcome. My name is Andrew Langer-Newton, and this is my channel on the legal and constitutional history of the Isle of Man. Today, I'm stood by the apex of the Isle of Man Constitution, Tynwald Hill, the site of the Tynwald Institution, reputed to be the oldest continuous legislature in the world. Tynwald celebrated its millennium of 1,000 years in 1979, nearly 50 years ago. But how do we know it was its millennium in 1979? And could it be even older than we think? Tynwald sits each year at Tynwald Hill on the 5th of July to proclaim the laws to the people, alongside the Tynwald Fair. This has been the case since 1752, when the change in the Gregorian calendar meant the sitting changed from the summer solstice to on the 24th of June to the 5th of July as it is today. But has Tynwald sat anywhere else, whether today or in history? These questions I'm going to consider in this video and propose answers to. I'm now stood in central Douglas, the capital city of the Isle of Man, outside the second site where Tynwald is sat. That is the Mona's Bank building, known today as the Wedding Cake building. Tynwald has sat at the Mona's Bank building since around 1879, shortly after the bank had collapsed and failed. So today, Tynwald sits at Tynwald Hill for its annual ceremony on the 5th of July, and also on the third Tuesday of each month at the Mona's Bank building, save for when Tynwald is in recess and not sitting. When Tynwald sits here, it sits as one chamber of two chambers together: the democratically elected House of Keys, elected at the general election, and the Legislative Council, the reviewing chamber, elected by a form of electoral college by the House of Keys. So I'll go on to now explore the sites around the Isle of Man where we know Tynwald has sat historically, but it no longer sits at today. I'm now stood in Castletown, the ancient capital of the Isle of Man, just by Castle Rushen, the seat of the kings of the Isle of Man and the lords of the Isle of Man when they were on island. And this is the first site where I've come to where Tynwald sat historically but no longer sits today as an institution. And the history of Castle Rushen is very interesting. It could stretch back to the 12th century and the visit of the Norwegian Viking king Magnus Bearlegs in the late 11th century, and then again in the early 12th century. And Magnus Bearlegs is recorded as having built 3 fortifications in the Isle of Man. We assume kind of moat and bailey style structures, fortifications, and they may be what we know today as Peel Castle, Castle Rushen, and also just outside of Port Erin, Cronk-How Moor. So they may be the 3 fortifications, and if Castle Rushen was one of those fortifications from the 12th century, it may well be that Castle Rushen was the site of the sittings of Tynwald from the 12th century. But what we certainly know is that recorded in documents, in the evidence, is that from the 15th century, Tynwald sat at Castle Rushen periodically. And for example, in 1430, we've got a record of a Tynwald sit-in presided by the representative of the King of the Isle of Man at the time, John Stanley. The King wasn't present at that sit-in, and the record suggests that the representative of the King who was presiding, he selected the 24 members of the Keys, what we know today as the House of Keys, still a constituent part of Tynwald. He selected them from proposals, a group of proposals, a cohort of proposals put forward from the people of the Sheedings of the Isle of Man in kind of a semi-democratic process in the 15th century to the election of the Keys, or by appointment. The Keys itself is a very interesting term. There's been several proposals put forward to the origin of the term keys, and I feel the most compelling one is that it was an English attempt in the 15th century with the arrival of the English kings of man, the Stanleys, to record this Manx Gaelic term for 24, the 24 leaders of the people of the Isle of Man, the 24 keys, and that was Ciar as Fyd. So it was an English attempt, an erroneous attempt at recording what they were hearing, as in the reference to the 24, Ciar as Fyd. And that's we retain that name in the House of Keys today. Maybe this erroneous English attempt at recording a Manx Gaelic term. Moving on, anyway, there's reference or records to Tynwald continuing to sit at Castle Rushen periodically after the 15th century, all the way through to the 19th century. And for example, we've got a record of a Tynwald court being held at Castle Rushen in 1757, where there was a law of Tynwald promulgated, which was the prohibition of secret marriages. And then into the 19th century, again all the way up into the 1860s, you've got references to Tynwald sitting periodically at Castle Rushen, holding Tynwald courts at Castle Rushen, and then, as documented earlier in this video, Tynwald moves permanently to the Mona's Bank building in 1879. So we're now in the Baldwin Valley in the centre of the Isle of Man, at the second of the sites where Tynwald has sat historically, but now no longer sits today. And the Baldwin Valley is interesting in its own right as a term, because to hear it, it's a very Anglo-Saxon term, Baldwin, and what many people think, who've thought long and hard on this subject, is that it derives from an anglicised attempt to record in the written records of the 15th century and later what was being heard by English coming to the Isle of Man in the 15th century. What was heard being said in Manx Gaelic, and then recording that, anglicising it. And it could be in Manx Gaelic two things. It could be a wide, deep valley, or it could be a reflection of the Isle of Man, the Manx Gaelic Fire Festival, the Yvalden, in early May, with the conflict between winter and summer, and that on its own would be a Balden, so similar to Baldwin. And if that is correct, then that would provide some circumstantial evidence for a long connection with the Baldwin Valley and the Celtic calendar of customs and events, festivals of coming together of the community, which not only connected with the changing calendar, but also brought the opportunity for legislative and legal events. And we can see similar things in the records of the Irish Gaelic system, pre-Viking system in Ireland, of the Enochs, or the fairs where the community came together and they chose a leader, or there was legislative and judicial decisions. But after that circumstantial evidence, we have real hard evidence to show that Tynwald did sit here in 1429, and that's the record of the laws of Tynwald of 1429, which wasn't presided over by the King of the Isle of Man at that time, John Stanley, but he had a representative there, and Tynwald sat here and passed laws, most notably the abolition of trial by trial by combat, I should say, and that does clearly state that Tynwald's at Keelhaven, where I am now. Actually, it wasn't this site where I am, this monument to Tynwald, which was built by the Isle of Man, the members of the Isle of Man Natural History and Antiquarian Society in the early 20th century, about over 100 years ago. It was, the early records point to it taking place in the higher field just north of the site now. Certainly that's where it's stated on the map from the 1860s. So we have real hard evidence of Tynwald here, but there is also more circumstantial evidence to point to Tynwald having presided here earlier than the 15th century, and that starts with, just further down the valley, the homestead of Algair, if my pronunciation is correct, and that has a root in Manx Gaelic from the word elg, and very similar to Irish Gaelic, that translates as the ridge or hill of justice, and there's a similar place in the Republic of Ireland, a Roscommon, which I think is the ridge of justice. So we've got a site just down the hill that points to it being the hill of justice, or the ridge of justice. Further on the west bank, there is the tree of Ballavru or Ballabru, and that translates as the place of the judge, or the homestead of the judge. So we've got two sites in the Baldwin Valley, Ridge of Justice and homestead of the judge, that would point, in Manx Gaelic, that would point to this site being a place of justice, of maybe legislation, earlier than the 15th century. Those do point to Tynwald not just being a one-off here in 1429, but having an established site that presumably the Stanleys, when they came in the 15th century, just adopted as an extant or an already existing place of legislation and judicial assembly. The final circumstantial point is that this site at Keelhaven, St Luke's in the Baldwin Valley, it sat adjacent to the Millennium Way as we now know it, but at the Royal Way in the 15th century, and the records from the 14th century point to this road running from Ramsey all the way down to Castle Rushen. Castle Rushen being the principal fortification in the Isle of Man, the centre of the governance and in the medieval period, and Ramsey being one of the most attractive harbours, safe harbour, because boats could go up the Ramsey River and anchor more safely. So it's on the Royal Way, that established maybe motorway for the medieval period through the Isle of Man from north to south, and it would make sense for there to be a Tynwald site here, because in the medieval period up till the 13th century, the members of the House of Keys, as we know it now, the members of Tynwald, 8 of them would have come from the Western Isles of Scotland as part of the Man and the Isles, the Kingdom of the Man and the Isles, and 16 of them would have come from the Isle of Man. So you'd have 24 members of the House of Keys, as we know it now, to use the modern terminology, 16 coming from the island, 8 having to come to the island from the Western Isles and land presumably at Ramsey as the most attractive harbour. So actually Keelhaven, where we are now in the Baldwin Valley, would have been not exactly an equidistant point, but the people coming from the north doing a lot of the difficult traversing over the hills, and the people coming from the south with a more leisurely route, but potentially longer. And even earlier than that, in the 12th century, there was actually 16 members of the House of Keys, to use modern terminology, that came from the Western Isles, and 16 that came from the Isle of Man, so a total number of 32. So actually this site at Keelhaven, whilst in our modern perception it's very isolated, it would have made maybe somewhat of an equitable sense to have it there between the north and the south. So it does point to this site not just being a one-off in 1429, but actually having an established role in the Manx constitution on the arrival of the Stanleys in the 15th century. I'm now at the most northerly site of Tynwald that I document in this video, and this is the third site where we know Tynwald sat historically but no longer sits today, and that is the site of the Hill of Reneurling in Kirkmichael. And similar to Kealaben and the Baldwin Tynwald site, we know Tynwald sat here in the 15th century because of a law of Tynwald of 1422 that records the sitting of Tynwald and the passing of laws such as the washing of whales ashore being the property of the king, to the expulsion of Scots from the Isle of Man. Now, the actual site of the Hill of Reneurling has perplexed historians for centuries. For a long time, there was a belief that it was the site of Knock y Troddan in the south of Kirkmichael, near Glenwillan, on the basis that Knock y Troddan had a similar sounding name to Reneurling. However, the hill at Knock y Troddan is isolated without any obvious and apparent connection with Kirkmichael as a site of justice or legislation, resolution of disputes. Now, some commentators and historians thinking on the subject have concluded that a hill just to the north of Kirkmichael is a much more likely site, and that is the hill of Cronk Croggy in Manx Gaelic, roughly translating as the place or the hill of the encounter, and that would support the idea of a place of resolving disputes. There's also evidence to point to it being a place of hangings. So you've got some circumstantial evidence of pointing to a place of dispute resolution and punishment of crimes. And that is the hill just on the edge of Kirkmichael, just north of the petrol station on the northern side of Kirkmichael. And in addition to that circumstantial evidence, there's also evidence to point to the fact that in the 15th and 16th century, the site was known as Nurlock, which is a term sounded similar to Reneurling. So you can see that there might have been some difference in recording a word that was used for the same place, Reneurling or Nurlock. Finally, the final piece of supporting evidence to the hill in the north of Kirkmichael being the site of the Tynwald at Reneurling is the fact that the law of 1422 documents that during the Tynwald, a rebellion rose up, a group of Manx rebels led by Mr. MacIsaac, who chased the king's governor, the king not being present at that Tynwald, and his soldiers from the Tynwald site, and they had to flee to the Kirkmichael church for safety. Ultimately, the rebellion was put down, and Mr. MacIsaac was brutally hung, drawn and quartered, and the rebellion quashed. Now, the historians rightly point to the fact that the northern hill is much closer to the church in Kirkmichael, which would support the idea that they had been able to flee from the Tynwald city into the church for safety, whereas Knock y Troddan in the south of Kirkmichael is such a distance away. It's inconceivable that the governor or the lieutenant of the king and his soldiers would have been able to flee from the Tynwald site to the church. So all that points towards the northern site being the site of Tynwald. So I'm now in Tynwald on the west extremity of Douglas. at a site which is the first site in this video where we don't know Tynwald sat as an institution, but there's some evidence to support them being a site pre-15th century where Tynwald may have sat. And that is, the principal evidence for that is the terminology, the place name, and that is Knock y Troddan. And similar to the site in Kirkmichael where we know Tynwald sat, and we think Cronk and Croggy is that location, which was the hill of the encounter. The Knock y Troddan is the hill of the conquest, which would again resonate with this idea of a place where disputes were resolved, communities came together to maybe enact punishments or declare laws and appoint leaders. And so this site on Archimode, Knock y Troddan, which is just across the river here, I'm on the east bank, that's just on the west bank, is that location. And as well as the name, there is some other very interesting supporting evidence that would support it being a Tynwald site, and that is the mound itself, which you can't see clearly here, but it's just on the other bank. And that mound, drawings made in the 19th century indicate it was like a tiered mound, similar to Tynwald Hill and other Thing sites, Tynwald sites, Thing sites being Viking assembly sites across the Viking world, such as in Dublin. And so this site, its name, Knock y Troddan, the place, the hill of the conquest, as well as the mound itself, does indicate that it could have been a Tynwald site on the east coast. There's rich Viking settlements here in the Braddon area, and then you've got the Keelhaven site just further north, so in proximity. This was also a Tynwald site, a place similar to the Irish Celtic system of the Enoch, the fair, where the community came together to choose a leader and to resolve disputes and declare laws. Also at this site there has been some Bronze Age remnants discovered, which would support it having a long history, and often communities would follow the same pattern and adopt places that historically had significance. And the final evidence is also that in the early 20th century or late 19th century there was a stone discovered there where there was a clear indication that it was used, that it had a groove in it where a foot could have been placed. And this was similar, this is believed to be similar to stones that were identified in Irish, Celtic, Gaelic history, which were where a new leader was appointed by placing their foot into the stone. And so this could very much have been a relic of this site, being a judicial, legislative Tynwald site, where a new leader was appointed by them placing their foot in the stone. I'm now in the Blustery South today, just on the road between St Mark's to Ballasalla, just south of St Mark's, at the second site in this video where there is some maybe circumstantial evidence of judicial or legislative type place of assembly, but we can't say for certain. The evidence is certainly not strong enough to say for certain. And that site is Knock y Troddan, a field just south of St Mark's. It's just this hill over here. Why we think that could be a site of judicial Tynwald style assembly principally is the term Knock y Troddan, which translates from the Manx Gaelic to hill of the judge, knock being a Manx Gaelic term for a hill, brew or brew being the Manx Gaelic term for a judge. And so that would support, maybe critically some might say circumstantially, this site being the prospect of being a historically pre-15th century, pre the arrival of the Stanleys, a site where there might have been a Tynwald assembly. Now the term brew is interesting, and it's been long thought of that the term brew was the Manx judge in the Manx constitution, the Isle of Man's constitution, prior to the arrival of the Vikings, and the term deemster, which we have today, or we know today, is the term Isle of Man judge. And so, interestingly, and the term brew is similar to, we can trace its origins, its terminology back to Irish Gaelic, with the judge they had there, or the Bray who, and anglicised to Brehon in the Irish Gaelic Celtic laws and systems. And so we can see a route there, but interestingly, a lecture very recently for the Isle of Man Natural History and Antiquarian Society, Dr. Joe Wolfe, who's written extensively on the history of the Isle of Man in the past, visiting the Isle of Man, indicated at that lecture that there was a belief now that the Deemster term may have arrived in the Isle of Man as late as the 15th century, brought by the Stanleys, the 15th century kings of the Isle of Man, when they arrived and started documenting the laws and constitution of the Isle of Man, because they heard and saw the existing office of judge, the brew, in the Isle of Man, and placed a title on it that they associated with that role in the north of England, and that being Deemster, or in Scotland, Doomster, the declarer of the doom. And although that the terminology will still trace its origins back to Scandinavia, maybe, it was the Stanleys who brought the term Deemster and replaced the term brew as late as the 15th century. So what we have at St Mark's is the prospect that there might have been a judicial, legislative assembly, maybe an assembly affair like the Enoch fairs in Irish Celtic system, and Tynwald in the Isle of Man, where there was leaders chosen, decisions made, punishments given, declared, and the other evidence that could possibly link this site to that is that its proximity to the Royal Way, the Millennium Way that runs down through the Isle of Man, similar to the site of Keelabin in Baldwin, which sits adjacent to the Royal Way. So the members of the House of Keys, to use today's terminology, the Keys come in from the Western Isles of Scotland to sit in the Assembly, and the Tynwald in the Kingdom of Man and the Isles would have used that route to travel down to the south of the island, and this site being adjacent to the Royal Way as it meets St Mark's and then goes towards the Ballymode, would maybe give some more circumstantial evidence to link this site with being a Tynwald site. In the production of this video, I was very grateful to benefit from the encouragement and publicity from Phil Gorn, Manx radio journalist, and his show Gollers Gacken on a Sunday evening. And Phil, as a former member of the House of Keys, member of Tynwald, he informed me that when he was an MHK, member of Tynwald, Tynwald sat at the building behind me for a period of time, St George's Court. It moved from the Mona's Bank building around the corner where it sits today, when it's not sitting on Tynwald Day, of course. And he said that was because there was some restoration or refurbishment going on in the Mona's Bank building. So I'm including this segment outside St George's Court for completeness. And if you, and I'm grateful for Phil for that information, if you're aware of any places where Tynwald may have sat, or institutions, legal, legislative institutions, please do contact me, drop a comment on the video, and I would be most grateful to hear of that information. Now, please follow this channel, give the video a like, and look out for my next video on the Battle of Santwat, a significant historical battle between the north and the south of the island, and one which the women of the Isle of Man played a significant role, and one that really is said to have left a lasting legacy on the rights of women in the Isle of Man and rights of equality. So thank you very much for listening. Gurumai Mored. I'll see you soon.